All right, welcome to another episode of Lifting and Yapping. Today I'm going to go through my Monday GPP workout and we're going to talk a little bit about the GAIT cycle because for me personally, the GAIT cycle was pivotal in changing my understanding of human movement and just reconciling so many ideas, bridging that gap between the weight room and then the sporting field. Not that I was even looking to do that at the time. Like, I couldn't even overcome the cognitive dissonance within the weightlifting community, just their understanding of what good or bad or efficient or inefficient movement may or may not be. And it was talking to all these GAIT nerds, a lot of which aren't interested in heavy lifting, but a lot of their concepts I felt like I could directly apply to my model of human movement. Like I said, for lifting, but then that had this trickle-down effect to the point where, for me personally, I view all movement as GAIT. So not just locomotion and sprinting and throwing and things that we stereotypically associate with the GAIT cycle. All right, so anyway, I'm gonna get into my warm-up. We got started with some crescendo leaps. You can probably see the full workout either to the right or left of you on the screen. And then just in between my sets, I'll talk about some of the ideas from the GAIT cycle or learning about the GAIT cycle that helped me more confident in the way I look at human movement and what the takeaways actually were. Okay, so let's start to analyze the GAIT cycle. So thinking about it from the perspective of walking or locomotion, you've got two main phases of GAIT. You've got the swing phase, where the limb is in the air, winding up, preparing to produce force. And then you've got the stance phase, when the limb is on the ground, pushing you along. So, and with this wind up and then this propulsive phase, there's actually distinctive joint actions associated with each of them. So when the limb is traveling through the air, winding up, preparing to produce force, we typically see this flexion, abduction, and external rotation of the limb. And then obviously as soon as we're interacting with the ground, we've got to go the opposite way. So we see all this extension, abduction, and internal rotation. Well, one way we could look at this is in the swing phase, or the wind-up phase, we're moving away from our midline, and then in any sort of propulsive movement where we're applying force into either the ground or an object, we'll be moving it back towards our midline. And this is probably, for you strength training enthusiasts, already getting some cogs turning. Wait, force production, we typically expect to see our limbs moving back in towards the midline. So why are people so obsessed with shoving their knees out in squats and a lot of other high force scenarios? And this is because there's this cognitive dissonance in strength training and a lot of sports where a lot of our technical model was developed back when we thought that certain joint actions were inherently more injurious than others. Now that we're learning that pain and injury is a little bit more complex than just the specific biomechanics of the situation, we're realizing that with our technical model, we need to reevaluate things from a purely efficiency perspective, not so much a safety perspective. Okay, so we've got these two alternating triads of movement. We've got flexion, abduction, external rotation to wind up, and then extension, adduction, internal rotation for the propulsive actions. And a lot of people actually just like to simplify these even further purely into the transverse plane. So this is a lot of compression expansion thinking, the model developed by Bill Hartman, where he just looks at this flexion, abduction, external rotation pattern as just an expression of external rotation. The way I reconcile that in my head is external rotation is just any movement away from the midline. And conversely to that then, any movement toward the midline is looked at as a representation of internal rotation. So, and in my world, that really simplifies things because especially if you look at the way people compensate in these either yielding or propulsive patterns, they will just trade off these external rotation representations for each other or these internal representations for each other. What do I mean by that? So, actually, let me do a set and I'll show you what I mean by that. And I know it's quite a hectic statement to take at face value, this idea that every single propulsive pattern is some sort of representation of internal rotation. But I tell you what, when you just sort of accept that, you get a lot of your biases confirmed. Like when you have a look at runners, whether they're beginners or whether they're elite, you see so much pronation when they're producing force on one leg. Everything sort of just seems to go in towards the midline. That's an alternating locomotive pattern where we're moving through the open and closed chain. There's a lot going on there. Let's talk about bilateral movements, staying entirely in the closed chain, like a squat. Again, what do we see on the way down? People do a great job of keeping the knees out. It's a really effective yielding pattern. As soon as they go to apply force though, what's the common technique breakdown that we see? Medial knee travel. But again, it makes a lot of sense because whenever we're producing force in every other context, we see so much pronation, internal rotation of just not one part of the system, the entire chain. See adduction as well. And it just sort of makes sense. We have more leverage to produce force when we're not so spread out, okay? So let's get away from lifting weights. Let's get away from trying to run faster. There was a really great grappling event over the weekend. I'm a big jiu-jitsu fan, so we had the ADCC, the Olympics of grappling, and the Craig Jones Invitational. So in grappling, if you're trying to immobilize or take advantage of your opponent, or if you're trying to submit them, what do? You will try to isolate their limbs away from their midline. People are not strong when they're spread eagle like this, when their system is externally rotated. If you want to have control of your limbs, if you want to be able to produce force and feel strong in jiu-jitsu, what do? As soon as someone's trying to take control of one of your limbs, you T-Rex, you bring everything in towards the midline. So we've got these pretty universal rules of human movement of just external rotation, or a bit more broadly than that, flexion, abduction, external rotation, being more commonly associated with the wind-up, extension, adduction, internal rotation for those propulsive actions. I'm not saying that you've only seen two representations of human movement. Well, I kind of am. There are two basic human movement patterns, and then we have the unique constraints of each task and the unique shape of each individual. And that's where we get these different representations of human movement. But generally speaking, it is just flexion, abduction, external rotation to wind up, extension, adduction, internal rotation to produce force, or ER, IR. Or as Bill would say, expansion, compression. One of the other ways that GAIT people, and also maybe this is more of a Bill Hartman concept in all honesty, another way they describe external versus internal rotation is external rotation is not only a movement away from the midline, but typically away from the ground or an object as well, versus internal rotation is not only a movement in towards our midline, but also a downward force into the ground or a force into an object. So some really great visual examples of this is if we think about our foot. So pronation is a byproduct of the system internally rotating down into the ground. This is a really interesting conversation because, again, going back to strength training and that outdated view of human movement where we're not just looking for efficiency, we're unnecessarily worried about certain types of movements being maybe more provocative or exposing you to a greater risk of injury, whereas now we're just sort of focused on efficiency because we realize that pain and injury, it's a bit more complex than just how you move. But something that's like a central technical theme in strength training and heavy lifting is people are always telling you to keep your weight over the midfoot. But then they're also telling you to do things like shove your knees out to the sides, avoid any pronation of the foot. But when your foot's pronated, that's the only time your midfoot's on the ground. So you want me to stay on my midfoot, but then you don't want me to let my midfoot touch the ground. So just supinating and shoving things out to the side as hard as possible. Is this really the most efficient way to produce force? And don't get me wrong, you will see people who are determined and who have the right leverages and the right setup. They'll successfully be able to keep parts of the system more relatively externally rotated, but something will fucking internally rotate. So again, thinking about or accepting this premise of internal rotation being a downward force into the ground or in towards your midline. We've got pronation is something that helps us push into the ground. But what's coupled with that, so as I'm getting my midfoot onto the ground by pronating, I'm also dorsiflexing. So people in this model or in this line of thinking about human movement, they will think about dorsiflexion. Again, it's coupled and expressed by pronation coupled with internal rotation. So that's another way we can push into the ground. We use our shins to push into the ground. This is something that's very common for track coaches to talk about this, to create a shin angle change for propulsion, sort of push the shins into the ground and then go. But so when people's knees shoot back in a heavy squat, how does their body help them push into the ground? So if shins are shooting back to counterbalance, we will internally rotate the entire torso into the ground. Okay, so we can use our legs to push into the ground, or we can use your torso to help you push into the ground. So internal rotation. And so then as someone who's pretty obsessed with strength training, how is that useful to me? I don't give a shit about someone's knees moving medially. In fact, I expect to see it when they're doing a hard squat. Like I said, for me, it's just so comforting to have a model of human movement that doesn't demonize certain joint actions, and it's really just trying to identify the most efficient patterns. And it's not that rigid either. It's just like, no, well, you will need to find some internal rotation somewhere to produce enough force to complete this task. Or, oh, you're trying to wind up? Well, you will have to relatively externally rotate the system to some extent to prepare the system to produce force efficiently. And then even when I'm looking at a movement that I haven't really been exposed to much of, the GAIT cycle still gives me this framework and some expectations about what I might be trying to see and how that might relate to the goals of each different phase of the movement. Come on. God. That was a really bad jerk. I'm better than that. I will try to be better than that. All right, moving on to squats. I don't know, so just going back to people's hesitancy or the associations with people who care about the GAIT cycle. Like even I have my stereotypes that I sort of think of as soon as someone brings up GAIT. I'm like, they probably don't like lifting heavy. They probably love breathing into balloons. Doing lots of sensory motor drills. They probably don't love heavy bilateral lifting, but I would argue that those people don't really understand the GAIT cycle either. To me, and like I said, not everyone has this shared understanding, like it can be a contentious topic. Is all movement GAIT? It's just, could be confirmation bias, but as soon as I accepted this idea that, generally speaking, wind-up patterns are a representation of external rotation, propulsive patterns are a representation of internal rotation, I couldn't unsee it. I mean, you could call it confirmation bias, but I do try to find examples of high-force scenarios where the system is just spreading itself away from the midline. But again, even just based on my experiences and all the different aspects of human movement that I've interacted with, I'm like, it seems to match up for me. Oh, one area that this did mess people up, and it wasn't the GAIT cycle's fault, it's just people not understanding what good coaching looks like. They sort of went from, well, and they still have this issue before the GAIT cycle, because again, they went from telling people to shove their knees out really hard to then all of a sudden trying to actively push their knees in. And the whole idea of the GAIT cycle and these couple joint actions is you don't have to think about pushing your knees in towards your midline. You just have to think about completing the task and applying force at the right time. Your body will take care of the knees out and the knees in for you. Again, what you'll see when you focus on just going down and then going up is things will generally move away from the midline to allow you to go down. Again, this is why, so I think a lot of people look at those old school West Side lifters with their feet out. This isn't a strategy, this squat setup. It's not a strategy to help you come out of the hole. They don't need any help with that. With all their equipment, with all their stiffness and their muscle mass, they need to come up with this exaggerated yielding strategy so they can even make it to depth. So, and again, there was this legacy effect of geared, equipped, wide stance squatting that it just took a long time to iron that out of strength training. Not that it needs to be completely ironed out, like wide stance lifting is still useful, it's just, there's too much of that. I mean, to be fair, with all the KOT split squats, it's actually pretty refreshing just to see someone spread them and then send their hips backwards onto a box. Yeah, we don't need pendulum swinging violently like that. I tell you what, a good length strengthening protocol, maybe if you combined those wide stance box squats with some KOT split squats, probably end up with a decent... I'm just going to cut myself off. All right, this set could be rough because I took a little bit too much of a rest in between. Okay, 130 for 5, and I think I've honestly got 2 reps left in the tank here, so this is pretty adherent. We're in the pocket. All right, 130 for 5. Legs are still stinging a little bit from the last set, but we're just gonna... I gotta get home and cook dinner. Oh my God. Want to train like me, get yourself a free trial of GPP. If you want to make content, grab the content creation and ecom guide I just released this week. It'll help you on the journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the YouTube channel. I really appreciate it so much. And if you're skeptical about people's thirst for long-form nuanced content, build people's trust by just getting them to pay attention to you for 3 seconds. I don't give a fuck how good of a coach you think you are. No one owes you their attention. So learn how to grab someone's attention and give them value in a shorter space of time. And short form content and social media will help you do that. To start to form an audience and to start this relationship building process with people that is building trust over time. Trust that every single second of attention that they give you, that you're going to deliver immense value, whether it's in the form of pure entertainment or enhancing their training. And you start that process through short form content creation and on socials, and then that gives you a funnel for a longer content platform like a YouTube channel or a podcast. And a lot of people, I think they get depressed about longer form content because it's harder to get the same sort of interaction because it's not as algorithm driven, but that's where you harness social media and short form content to funnel people into it. Like I said, all these frameworks are in the content and e-commerce guide. I'm gonna go bench, you're gonna go start your content creation journey, okay? See you next time.